You're listening to The Echoes with me, Emily Andrew, the self-development podcast that explores personal stories, powerful tools, and an insight into the wide world of mental, physical, and spiritual health. Get ready to get curious, be inspired, and connect in. My guest this week is a wonderful human that goes by the name of James Oliver. James is a men's work coach, podcaster, and founder of the men's community Brotherhood. He supports men in finding their authenticity and freedom through one-to-one coaching and mentorship, along with group workshops and retreats. In this episode, we'll be exploring shame, something that I believe every one of us is affected by in one way or another. We also hone in on the subject of sexual shame, which I think is a really incredible, important, and interesting topic to uncover. I hope you enjoy listening to this podcast as much as I loved being a part of it. And please excuse the very awkward introduction from me. I'm still getting my feet wet in this podcasting game again. Okay, so today I am really, really excited to welcome James. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. I was like, how do I do this? How do I do this again?
That's cool. We did it a few years back. Like we're just coming back to this kind of conversation. It's exciting.
I know. We were just reminiscing about my old podcast, Tribe Talk, and kind of realized James is one of the last guests to be on. And we were trying to figure out if he broke it or if we peaked.
I think ego's going to say the latter, but
yeah, I think
no, we realized that there was some pretty relevant circumstances that put a pause in that, i.e., having a child.
yeah, growing a human front. But thank you so much. I'm so excited to have you back on my new rebirth podcast journey. For anybody that doesn't know you, I guess the best place to start is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Tell me about you.
Cool. It's been a little while since I've done this. So so who am I? So my name's James Oliver. I am a men's work coach. I am a fellow podcaster. I am trying to think. I wear quite a few different hats. Men's work facilitator. I lead and was a founder of a men's community called Brotherhood. We do a lot of that cool kind of men's work stuff, getting men into their emotions, sharing circles, screaming at each other, crying. All of that real good stuff. I am a man. I am a partner. I am a keen runner, an exerciser, gym goer. Yeah, lots of different cool, funky things. But that's a little bit about me, I guess. Is that a succinct kind of good enough intro, or did you want a bit more?
No, absolutely. I think it's really interesting because when I came back and I recorded, who am I actually find that conversation or that question in itself quite challenging because we automatically go to what we do. And what we do is so much about who we are. And I just find that a really interesting thing because I think sometimes we can hide behind what we do as a way of explaining who we are. And
I love that, yeah.
It's I think it's a fascinating conversation. But I guess just to dig a little bit deeper, who are you when you're not at work?
I am like that. Because I sort of like paused when I went, I am a man. And I think that's probably because that was, out of all of those, the one that maybe requires a little bit more kind of diving into and unearthing what that really means, right? Not to bring it too deep too soon, but I think I'm a man on a journey to discover who he really is. A man who has, over the last, particularly probably the last 3 years, been on I'm really keen to have this conversation with you because since our last talk, which I think was like November 2020, I've been on a massive, massive journey with understanding who I am and exploring who I am, what that kind of, stuff beyond the labels of our jobs and our hobbies, like who am I, right? I think I'm a man who is incredibly invested in, understanding himself, very compassionate towards my own suffering, and I work very hard at exploring those areas of myself where I am suffering and looking to address those and heal those kind of face on. Yeah, I think I think that I am and have learned to become a lot more humble and less ego driven and fear driven. Whilst that stuff still very much exists within me, I am a lot more gentle with those parts of me than I used to be. And yeah, I think someone who's very accepting that concept will always be unfolding and expanding and growing. Yeah, this idea of like racing to or rushing to or stressing out in this pursuit of figuring out who we are, actually it's getting close to it, but always recognizing that you'll never quite like be it, because it just is constantly unfolding. Every interaction we have, every conversation we have, you asking me this question has helped me identify more about myself just by thinking about it. So it's just an ever expanding concept, really.
And I guess it's always something that's changing as well, because we kind of feel like we figured ourselves out, and then life happens, and we're like, oh wait, hang on, and there's an extra element to then understand more of. But I guess, what was the catalyst for explore, like for needing to go deeper, for asking yourself this question? Because I think that quite a lot of people in general, and especially men, are not as kind of looking into themselves, and not as open to exploring and journeying. So what was it that kind of created that fire start for you to go down this route?
I mean, just to speak to very quickly the men's stuff more broadly before I talk about me, but I think one of the reasons why men are so resistant, and the honest answer is scared to look inwards, is because men are raised and conditioned to believe that the answers lie outside of themselves. We are raised to believe that our worth is tied to, and our value to society is tied into how much we do. So how much we serve the world, serve others. And we are expressly guided away from looking inwards and understanding ourselves and accepting particularly all of ourselves. You know, there are characteristics and traits that are quote unquote masculine or accepted as manly, if you like, and some that are not. And so yeah, men are taught to look outwards for the answers. They're taught to look outwards for their purpose. They're taught to serve, their partners, to be the good husbands, to be the good fathers, to be the good employees, to be the good whatever it might be. But yeah, there's a real, then what we've actually done is we've conditioned men to become scared to look inside, because there's parts of us that we're told are not okay and not allowed to be there. So yeah, that's the men's stuff more broadly. I think with myself, I'm 33 now. For probably about six or 7 years, you know, very that I can recall very clearly, probably from the age of about 24 through to 30. That was where in my, you know, at that time in my life, I was having a lot of challenges with my, for example, mental health. The way that the things that were bringing up those challenges were my relationships with women. So the partnerships that I was in was just bringing up the most incredible, like they were the most triggering, most frightening things, where I would just lose all sense of self. I would lose all sense of self-worth, happiness, my ability to take responsibility for myself. I was unknowingly and unconsciously making the other person responsible for my happiness, for my safety, to make me feel good about me, you know, to make me feel good about myself. My relationship, obviously, with myself was one that just didn't exist, because I was just outsourcing my happiness to everyone around me. I was someone who never learned how to take responsibility for my own experience, my own happiness, my own, any part of my life, really. So I was constantly finding myself triggered, disappointed, let down, but people pleasing, and then trying harder to get the safety, trying harder to make the connections, the friendships, the relationships, and it just failing, and it just ended up spiraling. And one of the key relationships that I wasn't aware was causing me so much harm until it got to a breaking point, which was actually my 30th birthday, was the one with my dad. And he was he'd always been a very active, very present, very loving, very doing his best type father. He wasn't an absent father in terms of his effort or just his presence. He was there, and had always tried very, very hard. And yeah, it was only through kind of maybe in those later years, like 28, 29, 30, where the patterns within that partnership, within that sort of father-son relationship, excuse me, and the harm it was causing were just becoming, I was bumping up against it more and more and more, to the point where I didn't realize it at the time, but I was in a father-son relationship with a man who had no ability to take responsibility for anything. Everything else was always someone else's fault. Everything else there was always, if he upset someone, it's because they misunderstood. Or if he hurt someone or got something wrong, it was because of, he just never was taught how to take responsibility for anything. He'd never said, I'm sorry to me. And I spent a long time trying to recall times where he did, where he had done, and I couldn't recall any. So yeah, that relationship, I walked away from it. And it was really hard because he was someone who on the surface was a very present, very active, very loving, very supportive father. But a lot of that had been curated around his, and I would say unconscious or subconscious. I don't think it's something that he fully acts on and knows that he's doing. He will to a degree, but a lot of his actions were designed to position himself as the good, as the giving, as the benevolent, loving, always supporting his children father. So it was about his image rather than actually just being a genuinely present father. And yeah, I walked away. So that was one of the big catalysts. And the other one was also a relationship that I was in that ended at the beginning of 2022. As I said, that relationships were one of the most common places in my life where those issues around how I felt about myself would manifest and present themselves and just show up, after that honeymoon period, after that sort of 3 to 6 month mark of a relationship. All of my shit and all of my wounds and all of the stuff that I don't want them to see would be on show, and I would just collapse. And it was kind of mid 2021 when that had happened. I'd ended the relationship and we were in a process of getting back together or trying to figure stuff out. And I realized just how much shame I was carrying about just within me. I was carrying so much shame within me. And I guess, a couple of examples with that would be things like I would feel ashamed of noticing that I felt attracted to another woman. Because to me, that was something that would cause her pain. So I had this thing inside me that I felt wasn't okay, that I thought was either disloyal or disgraceful or disgusting or whatever it was. Like, that is just not okay. That's not allowed. So I would have something that's perfectly natural within me, but the story I was telling myself about it was one of shame. That's not allowed. That's awful. You can't have that. That's not what the perfect boyfriend would be and what you should be. So something as simple as that, I wasn't managing effectively, and I wasn't managing with grace and compassion and understanding and just a level of reality. It's a very real, normal thing. So at the end of that relationship in 2022, January 22, I think it was, particularly the relationship stuff. I mean, separate to that, I still wasn't talking to my dad at the time. But I committed at the beginning of 2022 to spending an entire year studying myself and diving into all areas of who I was that brought up shame, the parts of myself that I thought would be judged and rejected, and I don't know, that were either embarrassing or humiliating or disgusting or whatever that was. And yeah, I went on like this wonderful, explorative, expansive journey of getting to, I guess it comes back to that first question that we talked about, like, who am I, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just went all in on it, and it ended up being a pretty fucking wild ride.
I'm so looking forward to diving in. So, in terms, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because when we find when we're doing self-development work, we end up kind of knocking up against these things that we realize we've been carrying with us that just feel so old that they're kind of ingrained into our DNA. And I think
Mm,
sometimes they are, you know, it sounds like the patterns between the responsibility, like you feeling at one point like you weren't able to take responsibility for yourself, was something that you'd kind of learn or taken on. And I think the difficulty is when you are somebody that does look inward and does kind of work on the parts of themselves that perhaps aren't as helpful, it's in it's hard, but it's easier to work on yourself and work through that than it is to realize that the people around you are carrying the same stories that you once held, and you have no kind of control over whether they work on it or not. And
mm,
kind of that in itself can be a really difficult pattern or lesson to learn, because you know we're not responsible for other people's actions and other people's growth or development. And
yeah.
you know, if we shine a light or choose to shine a light on it for ourselves, it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody else may be ready and making those decisions,
Mm,
you know, to protect yourself, to create boundaries and respect yourself in that way can be really, really difficult.
yeah.
um
I would say just on that, I've noticed that, in the last 3 years since I've been going through all this stuff, like everything in my life has changed. My friendship group has changed. Where I choose to invest energy into friendships and certain people has changed. The way that I show up, the way that I speak, the how I choose and where I choose to, invest energy into relationships, whether it be my my parents, my brothers, my partner now. Friendships is definitely a big one. Colleagues, all of it is you do begin to recognize when you start taking responsibility for yourself, how many of the people in your life aren't doing that. And by default, and that can be one of the biggest challenges of going on any sort of self-development, growth, healing journey, whatever you want to call it, is that the stuff you begin to take responsibility for, you become so hyper aware of all of the people around you that are not doing it. And you realize you were just all in the same boat, right? You were all, for want of a better term, vibrating at the same frequency. That lack of consciousness, that lack of radical honesty with yourself, that lack of radical responsibility and taking it fair as much as you can for what goes on in your life. But when you suddenly begin to do that and find yourself surrounded by people not doing it, you realize that they're not through any of their own fault, not to blame anyone, but they're actually they'll find it very difficult to be around you as you grow and as you change and as you begin to get to know yourself more, because it becomes quite a challenging mirror for them.
mm. Yeah, and I think also you kind of at the beginning as well, it also becomes quite a triggering experience for you to be around. So
Mm-hmm.
it's almost like you repel that the kind of part of yourself that you're trying to work on for a time, and that in itself can be a difficult thing. I kind of always say it's when you get to the quiet confidence of like knowing who you are and not being so triggered by the world around
Mm.
you, like that's when it feels when it gets easier, but that takes time and it takes like practice and patience, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of the relationships that you have built over your life, whether it was, I don't know, the friendships that you've carried on, investing energy into since school, and, the dynamic that you've always had with your mom or whatever it is, right? Like, throughout all of that time that you've had those relationships, there is a part of you that has felt accepted by that person just by way of the fact that you are in their life. And as you begin to change and let's just say, better yourself and get to know yourself more and heal. That's all positive work. It doesn't feel like it. Sometimes it's dark and scary and feels fucking awful. But as you invest your time and energy into that work, there is a part of you that will then feel like you want to go back to those people and say, look at who I'm becoming. Look at how much like happier I am. And one of the hardest parts of that is that they may not or likely will not receive it in that way. They will see you growing and moving away from them, and it will hold up a mirror to their lack of doing so. And you can kind of go through this period. Some people move through it very quickly and they're able to just let go of the expectations that they were having of these friends or these people to be able to accept this new version of them. Sometimes it takes a lot longer because we're just so scared of actually leaving behind that version of the relationship, because we are actually going through a process of like a rupture and an ending of that relationship as it was, because the relationships can't stay the same as you've grown and changed. But we try so hard. We try so hard to be like, we go and try and negotiate. We try like, no, I can get them to accept me and like me for who I am now, because I really like me for who I am now. And, there's got to be a way, right? But as you said, it just comes down to that simple fact of, if they're not on their own journey, then they can't respect not because they're a bad person, but they just cannot respect the work that you're doing because they can't appreciate and understand it, because they're just not doing it. It's not a shared experience, or there's a real challenge with empathizing with that experience. It's a hard thing to do if you're just not doing it yourself.
Well, also because it's a threat. Like you're threatening the way that they are in life. And by you kind of stepping out and doing something different, even if you're not intentionally saying it or doing it or even thinking it, a part of them may feel like, well, you're saying that I've been doing it wrong all this time, or I'm not doing it. It's like a threat to how they are,
Mm.
which is in itself going to be really difficult. Like it's like you're all in the mud together at one point, and everyone's unconscious and happy in like a bit of an unhappy way. But it's like if you dare to step out in the mud, it's almost like it's such a change for everybody involved, and that can be really difficult for some people. And some people might just go, you know what, actually I can't do this, I'm just going to get back in the mud. Like it felt easier that way. And
Just like stopping drinking, right? Like
yeah.
if you stop drinking, like, which I know is something that you've been through, the people who you are around by default assume that you are judging them for drinking, because they just cannot shake the lens through which they see your behavior. They can't step away from it. And
Mm-hmm.
so they immediately, ego, narcissism, whatever it is, right? That's driving that fear, all kind of tied up in one and the same, those parts. But they are not able to see your change in behavior solely as a driver for your own positive change.
Mm-hmm.
They can only see it through the lens of which they judge themselves. And so they assume that you're judging them too because you've stopped the behavior and they haven't. And it's got nothing to do with them. There are people in my life, I barely drink anymore. I probably drink 2-3 times a year now. And I've learned my relationship with that is it's all about who I'm drinking and if I feel safe enough to be myself around the people that I'm drinking with. If they are people who love me and accept me for who I am now, there's the likelihood that I would feel very comfortable getting really pissed with them if I wanted to, right? Probably don't. But if I'm around people that actually I feel like I have to hide parts of myself around, well, that's where drinking feels very unsafe for me. And I just will not do it. I won't put myself in those positions. I'll gladly, boldly, confidently either step away from those situations or just say no to putting myself in them in the first place.
Yeah. Talk to me about shame then. So you kind of, because it's one of those universal subjects. It's a bit like, whenever I look at belief work with people and like I'm not good enough comes up. And, shame is something that I think many people aren't aware of experiencing, holding, and kind of carrying with them. But actually, there is so much shame in our lives, either the way that we have been raised or conditioned to believe. And talk to me about how you got into kind of exploring shame and what you did.
Sure. So it's a struggle to try and remember. I came in, I think the first, my first kind of foray into shame work was like mid 2021 when I think just by at that point I'd been kind of showing up online and getting into kind of like well-being and mental health and men's mental health and masculinity and all of these sorts of conversations. I've been, I had my old Instagram handle, like The Honest Bloke, which is about men talking about mental health. And just by being in and around those conversations, the topic of shame came into my, into my awareness. It just came into my kind of my field. And it was like, I think it was, because the relationship that I was in at the time, it made me realize that there were lots of things around the relationship specifically where I was feeling ashamed. And I guess just to maybe touch on what shame is, because a lot of people, you're kind of right, they don't really connect with shame. They don't realize that shame is what they're feeling. But shame is probably like the deeper kind of root cause of what you're feeling. But the surface level manifestations of that in your life, the way that might be showing up, could be anything from anything that you feel embarrassed over, any situations where you feel like you have to pretend to be something that you're not, force yourself to behave in a certain way, wear a mask. A common one might be the way that men interact in social environments. There have to be a bit of laddie and a bit bantery. Not that those aren't great aspects of their own right, but a lot of it is forced and a lot of it is a mask to hide other aspects of who they are that don't feel welcome or safe to be seen in those environments. Shame can be things like people pleasing, like the reason that you people please is it's like an overt attempt to try and do so much for someone that it hides something that you're maybe not intentionally trying to hide. You're not consciously aware that you're trying to hide, but it's usually because the thing that you feel ashamed over, you might feel ashamed over your lack of ability to set boundaries. It can be anything to do with a part of who you are that has been made to feel at some point in your life unwelcome, not allowed, there's no permission. You have to reject it, you have to hide it. And as a result, you have almost exiled it from this idea of who we are and our perception of self. So what happens is we go through something in our lives, which is usually quite a triggering, quote unquote, traumatic experience where a part of ourself gets brought into the world and it's met with rejection, humiliation, judgment. And so we learn that isn't, well, I don't want to experience this again. So our nervous system, our mind, all of it just shuts it and locks it away. And, one of those for me was I felt shame for my intelligence. I have felt shame for being really, when I was like really young, I was at the top of every class. I was reading in front of, when I was 2.5, I was taught to read because my older brother at 4 was learning to read. And my dad just used to sit us either side. And he accidentally taught me that the way I receive love from my dad is to compete and to be good at things. So it unknowingly and accidentally created this like spark and this deep desire and need to be the best at everything. But because I was never taught that and I was never taught how to manage that, I would often try really hard to be good at things. I'd be the best at them, usually quite academically. But then I didn't know how to, I was expecting loads of praise and loads of adoration and celebration, but I'd often come across as arrogant and thinking that I was better than people. So I didn't know how to manage that part of me and I became very ashamed of it. There's quite a few, but I think one of the main ones that was particularly showing up in my life in that relationship was around, a lot of it was around sex. And I think one of the main, my sexuality, my sexual expression, put it this way, if I felt ashamed of even finding another person attractive whilst in a monogamous relationship, if I felt deep shame for that, how much else do you think I was repressing or hiding or feeling ashamed over in terms of desires, in terms of what my needs were, things I wanted to explore, right? So if I couldn't even give myself permission to feel attraction to another woman whilst I was in a relationship, not that I was wanting to act on it, not that I was acting on it, But if I felt so deeply ashamed of that, it was like, well, how much else is back there? So when that relationship ended so January 22, one of the biggest areas of my life that I began to explore was my sexuality, my sexual expression, and I gave myself full permission to do that. If we look at it, and this is in a, I guess I want to frame this as just to look at it from the binary sense of men and women, not to reject anyone who is non-binary, but this is just because I'm confident in speaking about it through this lens. But women are shamed for their sexuality. Women, I think it's most people would agree that women are not allowed to be sexual, so therefore they are taught that their sexuality is not welcome. Men are shamed for their sexuality because it's almost like they are just these animals that want to fuck everything, and there's no depth to their sexuality. And so the part of them that actually has desires and, like I say, I think of sexuality as my sexual expression, my way of expressing myself and kind of having fun and connecting and understanding who I am and what I like. And men are not allowed to have that. If let's just say a man and a woman are in a partnership, and the man expresses a desire to have a threesome. Well, a lot of that would be met with, well, fucking course he does. It's like, oh, because he wants to shag everything. But actually, there might be beyond that. There might be a deep desire for him to experience that because it's a fantasy of his, and that truth is just not given the space to exist because men are reduced and minimized to their sexual urges and just a desire to fuck everything. So we all experience, I think, sexual shame. Society shames sex. So regardless, I guess, your gender identity, that is very common. Mine came from my upbringing. My dad was a massive prude. My mum never introduced sex to us in a healthy way, and it got rejected and shamed within me personally, in a number of ways. And so I realized that probably from when I became sexually active at 15 was when I lost my virginity through to the age of 31. I'd become ashamed of a massive part of who I was. So basically I said to myself, if I were to remove shame from the equation, hypothetically, what would I do? I was like, I'd love to go to a sex party. I'd love to jump into, I'd love to find myself and explore myself in these sex positive, non-judgmental, very welcoming communities. So I began doing that. I jumped into, there's a company called Killing Kittens who, don't understand the name, by the way. There is a reference to it, but very, very big sex positive community. And I jumped into that community and started connecting with, into the group chats, one-on-one with certain women, was just finding my way with it. I dated an escort for probably about 6 months last year, who was on there because she was having no fulfilling, meaningful, she wasn't having great sex. She was having sex through work. And she was looking to actually really find a way of enjoying herself sexually. And, we had that relationship. It wasn't one that developed into a monogamous relationship, but I learned so much about sex work, the sex work industry. And I just have the most, not that I ever carried judgment. Well, I did maybe many years ago, but I definitely didn't last year. But I just had so much adoration and respect for anyone in that industry and the journey that they're on to probably reclaiming their sexuality and healing their sexuality. I went to my first sex party, and it was just the most, you've got all of the exciting kind of weird and wonderful stuff that happened, right? But it was the fact that it was a massive part. It was their summer ball with 700 people. It was at Ministry of Sound in London. It was one of their biggest events of the year. So bit of a baptism of fire. But it was just the fact that it felt so safe and so welcoming, and everyone was so nice. And I just felt this I was in this community of people that had completely unshamed their own sexuality, and felt, it just naturally, by way of that, it helped anyone stepping into that space to feel less shame. And so I felt like, oh, fuck, I don't have to feel ashamed of this. I don't have to feel ashamed of my my desires to be in these sorts of places, or just at least even just try them and even explore them and just see. I might have gone and just not liked it. I might have gone there and gone, okay, cool, I've done it, but I don't really think that's for me anymore. And it was just finding myself in these spaces and suddenly realizing that there are people out there who have, whether they've consciously gone to unshame themselves and go about it through that lens, or whether they've just gone, actually, I just really want to try this thing and it feels really good and I really enjoy it. And that's now something that I see as a part of myself. So yeah, that was like a big part of my journey. It's led me into a relationship with someone that, we are finding our way with, an element of like non-monogamy and having a more open relationship, which again, to any listeners, that can definitely bring up some discomfort. It can bring up some triggers. It can bring up some judgment. People might hear that and potentially judge me, and that's absolutely fine. I don't have any issues with anyone doing that. It's a reflection of your own relationship to that type of relationship, and that's okay. I'm not telling you need to be okay with it, but it's about me and my partner finding a way to get our needs met, to explore who we are, to be in a relationship that feels expansive and exciting and connecting. And I think it creates a level of trust and a level of love that I've never had before. So, yeah. Does that answer your question? That was quite
like it's so fascinating, and like it's interesting because as somebody who has probably experienced similar in terms of like sexual shame and from upbringing and everything like that, I cannot fathom how you go from that place to going to a sex party. Like I find it fascinating. And like how did you get there? Like, not in terms of like, did you get the bus or did you get the train? But like in terms of like, how do you go from feeling, there being a part of you that is that ashamed to being in an environment like that? Like, because me imagining it, like, I think I think I'd just be really awkward, like, and not know what to do. But like, did you have to do work on yourself and on your relationship with shame before you got there? Was that kind of later down the process, or was it kind of like, look, I've identified that this has been something that I'm interested in doing, but I've always felt shame of doing it. So I'm just going to like dive in and do it. Like, what was that?
I think it was, obviously there was a permission element, i.e., I'd left the relationship, I was single, so I it was very easy for me to give myself permission to kind of step in and explore this stuff. It wasn't so many people. One of the most challenging things I've seen through, whether it's client work with my clients, whether it's just conversations with friends, is people who are in monogamous relationships right now who have desires to expand their relationship. That's a very, very difficult situation to navigate. So I had the privilege and the freedom to be a single person. And I think it was quite an easy decision for me, because when you realize how long you've been holding on to shame and how much pain it's been causing you, and then you realize that letting go of the shame is very likely the antidote to that, and feeling more free and feeling more yourself and feeling more happy and more fulfilled, then it's quite an easy decision. Obviously, yeah, there were a few months in the lead up to that where I begun exploring these spaces. I was connecting with women who were on their own journeys, and I had a couple of like, go and meet someone, go have lunch, like stay in a hotel together, like have like a sexual experience with that person. And it was just all of those interactions that suddenly felt like, oh, hang on, all of the stories that I've learned or been telling myself about what sex should and shouldn't be are all false. And there are women who are, one of the most common misconceptions is that women, all by default and only want sex to be like meaningful and lead to a relationship, and that's a massive stereotype, right? But that women are only invested in like emotional sex, and it's a lie. Like it's just not true. Women have been shamed into believing that that's what sex should mean for them. And a lot of them embody that. And a lot of them have kind of been so immersed in that narrative that they can't see beyond it. But women's pleasure is just as equal and value, and valid as men's pleasure, anyone's pleasure. So yeah, it's seeing these women being on their journeys around reconnecting and reclaiming their sexuality and their pleasure and their bodies. It just felt like I was doing the same, but just maybe through a slightly different lens. And it's like unshaming parts of yourself is just one of the most beautiful and healing processes, because you don't, I mean, I describe it with my clients as like, not necessarily always around shame, but maybe it's around a belief that they have about themselves, or something about their relationship, is that if something has always been that way, and ever since you can remember it's always been that way, well, it's very, very difficult to raise yourself to a level of consciousness, a level of awareness, a level of curiosity, and a level of challenging the way that you see the world. Because if it's always been that way, you will not know any different, and you will believe that's the way that they are. That's the way things are. That's like fact. There's no challenging that. There's no subjectivity to it. But then all of a sudden you find yourself in these spaces and you're like, oh, fuck, everything I ever thought about this behavior or this feeling or this thought or whatever it might be is just not fucking true. It's like a real limited, disconnected, false truth. It just doesn't exist. And it's that has been, created in society through shame. It's been created. It shames every single one of us into keeping ourselves small, not expressing ourselves, not understanding who we are, not being free, not being playful, not being explorative, and keeping us as like the good little people or men or women that we quote unquote should be. And it's nice not to have to subscribe to that anymore.
So I guess from your experience, all of those things that you just listed off, that's what you've reclaimed from unshaming yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and it's not to say that it doesn't still show up. It's not to say that it's not still present. There are moments where I feel myself contract and feel myself avoid having a conversation about something because it feels too scary. I don't think there's an end goal. I don't think there's, and like a destination that you arrive at where you're completely unshamed. But I think you just continue to put yourself in places and environments. Another example that's just away from the sex stuff would be last year this was kind of in and around the same time. I went to a retreat in Ibiza, which was like a plant medicine retreat. So we had a couple of like psilocybin magic mushroom ceremonies. It was my first time ever doing any sort of plant medicine work. And one of the most deeply transformational experiences of my life. Disclaimer, not promoting use of psychedelics, but just talking about my experience. I remember in the final sharing circle at the end of that week, we all went round and shared what had come up for us, whether it was in the last ceremony or what we were taking away from the week. And something magical happened for me in those sharing circles that we had every day. And what it was I was given the space to express myself. I was given the space to speak and share what was on my mind, what was coming up. And throughout the week, this really weird thing kept happening. Like people would come up to me after the sharing circle or later in the evening or before the ceremony or whatever it was. It kept happening. They would come up and say, James, the way that you articulate yourself is so incredible. Like you're so eloquent. You speak so beautifully. And it caught me off guard a few times. And by the end of the week, it was because I realized that I'd spent my life surrounded by people that quality within me made them feel less than or not good enough. And so anytime I ever, particularly as a man, who also likes to do things like go to the pub, watch the footy, go out and get pissed, all that sort of stuff, quite regular, regular Joe, normal bloke things to do, that when I would speak in a way that was perceivably eloquent or articulate or intelligent, I would just get ripped down for it. I would get ridiculed or, cut off or chopped down in so many areas. I'd just never been in environments where that was welcome and that was celebrated. And so just that feedback, I began to realize, oh fuck, there's something within me that actually is really, really great, and is a lovely quality that is a big part of who I am, that I have to repress, I have to hide, I have to play down, I have to keep it hidden, that I am ashamed of, that I shouldn't be. So like I say, just putting yourself or finding yourself in these spaces where parts of who you are welcomed and celebrated. It's the greatest medicine there is.
Mm. And I guess it's being seen as well,
Mm-hmm.
isn't it? Like something that so many of us crave, but also are deeply fearful of, is that moment where somebody actually looks, and it's that looks into our eyes and looks into our soul and sees us for who we really are in that moment. And that can
Yeah.
be petrifying. And
Yeah.
but it's equally just as liberating. It just depends how you take it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly that. There's taking the leap, right? Like when you make the decision to express yourself or to expose a part of yourself, that the parts of you that have learned to protect that part of you are the ones that go, no, 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 this is unsafe. We don't share this. We keep this hidden. We keep it away. We don't share it with the world. That part of you has learned that it is unsafe, so it will fight. Yeah, there's like this leap of faith moment, right? There's this leap of faith moment where sharing, because shame cannot survive when it's brought into the light. So sharing the parts of you that you are ashamed of is how you dispel and how you get rid of and heal your shame. But there is a part of you that has become a protector of that shamed part. So it assumed this role. It got forced into this role of, well, you know what? We have to keep this part hidden, and we'll do it by any means necessary. Because at some point in the past, we exposed that part of ourselves to in a conversation or to a friend, and we got shamed, rejected, humiliated. So this protector part will kick in, and what it will do is it will go, right, well, I'm gonna stop this from being shown to the world. And it might do that by being a harsh critic. It might be being really hard on yourself. It might, it's usually it judges that part of you. So that's how we, become quite self-critical or self-judging. And when we decide to take this leap of faith and actually share that part of us with another person, that's where the fear is most, like, it can be crippling, because we're about to say, right, I'm going to share this part of me that I've kept hidden for years, decades, sometimes even. And the likelihood is that, well, the part of you that learned that you're going to get rejected for it is going to fight you. It's going to say, don't do it. I'm not going to let you do it. But the moment where you share a part of who you are that you carry shame over, and it is met with acceptance, non-judgment, celebration, well, that is one of the most magical experiences, and that is one of the most healing experiences that we can have. And it largely is, it forms a kind of a real pillar of the work that I do with men, just because there's so much about who we are as men that is shamed, and we're taught we shouldn't be, and we're taught to hide, and we're taught to cut ourselves off from. And when we reclaim that part of ourselves, it becomes just this life force, this power, this joyful energy that is like, actually, fuck, my happiness is found from reclaiming these parts of me, not continuing to pretend to be something that I'm not continuing to reject these parts of myself that exist within me.
Mm. So there's a big process of like uncovering, understanding, unlearning. What are the tools that support you in that process? Because there's a lot of kind of vulnerability there, and kind of it sounds like there's lots of different elements, emotions, things that will come up in that protector part. Like, what have been the tools that you use or you utilize with the people that you work with that you found to be really transformative in that process? Because as much as I would love to, it's not that easy to pop onto a medicinal mushroom retreat. So what can we do now that can support us in that journey of unshaming ourselves?
So I'd say three things: compassion, curiosity, and community. So three C's, quite nicely. Um, Compassion, and more accurately, self compassion is, it's getting a lot of like, there's a lot of conversations around it. I think that we're starting to see the word compassion thrown around and introduced into spaces, into wellness spaces, which is absolutely incredible. I think getting very, very clear on what self compassion is and beginning to practice it and harness what that is, because we ultimately, self compassion is the antidote to shame. So, my favorite definition of compassion is, compassion is the feeling where you notice or sense the suffering in another person and you feel called to help alleviate that suffering. So therefore, the idea of self-compassion is that's directed towards self, is we notice that there is something within us that is causing us suffering, and we feel called to take some sort of action to ease our own suffering. And shame is one of the deepest, most harmful, hurtful ways that we suffer within ourselves. So just beginning to to nurture the power and the practice of self-compassion. For me, and that's a really good point you mentioned about the retreat. I did about 9 months of deep self-compassion work before I went on to that retreat. And that to me wasn't just like this magical, fast fix, transformative experience. It was the final piece of a puzzle that had been nearly the best part of a year's worth of work. So the self-compassion piece is important. Curiosity is like developing this perspective and this lens of, what am I not seeing here, or what don't I know about what's going on here? How can I learn more? How can I be a student in what I'm trying to learn or understand here? Particularly around ourselves, we have this false notion that because we are us and we are, I am me, I am James, that I understand everything about myself because I am that person. And when you take a step back and realize that, how much time have you ever given yourself to study who you are and question the parts of yourself? The likelihood is it's not because you've just been so busy being you that you haven't been trying to question the parts of you that maybe cause you challenge or discomfort or emotional pain. So the question, and it ties in with compassion, that I love is, what suffering am I not seeing? It's a wonderful thing. I think always start with directing that at yourself first, but yeah, get curious about it. What suffering am I not seeing within myself? And that also then hopefully is one of the things that, as you cultivate that sense within you, you then learn to see it in the outside world, and you sort of stop. It actually helps you learn to stop being triggered by things, because when people act or do or behave in ways that are causing harm or upsetting, you learn to realize, not that not that it kind of justifies their behavior and not that it excuses it, but you learn to just be like, okay, that person, even if they don't realize it, they're suffering. So that's curiosity. And the third one is just community. As I say, whether it was a community of people that welcomed a part of me, and celebrated a part of me that I'd never experienced, which was, again, like the way that I articulate myself, the way that I speak, whether it's a sex positive community that just collectively, shame is just not present around sex and sexuality in those spaces. Find yourself communities, follow people online, go to your social media, cleanse it, start again, follow people that light you up, that make your nervous system feel good, that make you feel safe, that make you feel like you can explore who you are in their space. Join, like for men, for example, online men's communities, sharing circles. On Brotherhood, my men's community, we have a WhatsApp community, we have an online sharing circle once a month. That's all free. And show up in those spaces. It's scary, but it's the key to healing, the key to understanding yourself, key to that those sorts of things are the key to freedom and finding out who you are and letting go of your shame.
Amazing. I've absolutely adored this conversation. I knew I would. And
Thank you. Me too.
thank you. And it's just been really interesting. And I think that it's such a massive conversation. I'm sure we could talk about it for ages, but I think that that's a really good introduction for anybody who is interested or maybe didn't even realize they were interested in looking at shame and, you know, the stories that we tell ourselves around shame and the beliefs that we hold around it. Because I
Mm,
think you're right, it is curiosity is the start of so many things because we have to get curious. If we look at something with judgment, we shut the door straight away into looking and changing that. But the curiosity aspect, it takes away some of the kind of the voices and the stories that we hold coming into the forefront, takes that away a little bit. So
for
thank you
sure.
so much. Where can people find you?
Yeah, online. My Instagram is James Oliver _ men's coach. One Brotherhood and men's community is at We Are One Brotherhood. I've got mailing lists on both, websites on both, but just drop me a DM if you want to chat, if there's anything that I can support you with, resources, all of that sort of, all that good stuff. Just drop me a DM. Always happy to connect and hear from people.
Amazing. I'll put everything in the show notes as well. So you can just go down, click. And while you're there, you might as well rate this conversation with 5 stars because that'd be amazing. But thank you so much, James. I've really, really enjoyed today. And hopefully we'll talk soon.
Sure we will. Thank you for having me on.